Nothing else has defined the past generation in Washington, D.C. quite so much as the massive urban redevelopment that has caught fire all over town, dramatically reshaping the city landscape in the process. Yet over the past few years, the largest scale and most conspicuous of all of these projects has been the District Wharf. Conceived by real estate developer P.N. Hoffman, the wharf began construction in 2014. As Phase 1 was completed last year, a staggering 2 million square feet of space, valued at about $1.2 billion overall, had been established across 12 acres of the waterfront in southwest Washington. Phase 2 begins later this year and will essentially double the size of the wharf by the time of its scheduled completion in 2022.
It's crazy what's been happening and how it's been changing, and it went from being nothing to now being a whole neighborhood in Washington, D.C., so it's something to be reckoned with.
It's a time of new beginnings, it's a time of transformation for that neighborhood, and there are lots of things to talk about associated with that.
The emergence of the wharf is perhaps best understood as part of the narrative of all the massive reconstruction that has taken place across the city of Washington over the last few decades. An overview of the state, which America's capital had ascended into by the late 20th century, will underscore why this sort of additional attention and development was so critical to begin with.
It's important when we think about Washington that we're very honest and candid about our history. And we have a history of racial segregation in the city.
Growing up in Washington, D.C., you would never really drive outside of Northwest Washington, D.C. There was no real reason to venture out to, Southeast D.C., Northeast D.C. There was just a lot of poverty, a lot of crime, and, just not a lot of amenities that would attract people to go there and spend time and money.
We were a city that only 20 years ago was totally bankrupt, with horrendous unemployment and a very deficient amount of capacity within the local government. So to see the private sector wanting to invest in the city is fundamentally very positive.
In the 90s, under Mayor Anthony Williams, there was the idea, the planning to bring the population back to Washington, D.C. So the goal was 100,000 new residents. And it seemed ludicrous at the time because Washington, D.C. had been losing population since 1950. So if you want to have that greater population, you need a lot of things to come together, as far as development, as far as amenities, as far as just the housing for it.
This newfound ambition of the City Council, combined with the private sector's gradual willingness to participate, would soon be visibly manifested in many neighborhoods, including 14th Street, U Street, Columbia Heights, and Gallery Place. However, at first these revitalized regions were disproportionately featured in the Northwest Quadrant, which, for all of its troubles, was still the home to the bulk of the federal government and major cultural destinations in Washington. In time, the city would turn its attention to the other three quadrants, which were badly neglected by comparison, and maybe even without.
The land prices in those areas were just really suppressed and really cheap land, honestly. So people saw opportunities to go into these neighborhoods and buy acres at a time. Big developers would buy acres at a time, and then really just start planning communities in all of this empty wasteland space that were just grass fields and parking lots and just dirt. So basically the wharf being the closest one to the monuments and stuff like that was kind of like the first one in the pipeline, concurrently at the same time as the Nat Stadium, which is only a couple blocks away from the wharf.
Is Southwest DC such a stranger to urban redevelopment? No, in that in the 1960s, the neighborhood had undergone one of the largest and most controversial urban renewal programs in the city's history. But yes, in in the sense that no major-scale redevelopment would take place in Southwest for the rest of the 20th century, and much was left unfulfilled from the initial vision that had sparked this near-total remodeling of the quadrant.
It's a quadrant of DC that was, badly neglected. It was, frankly, kind of what sounds like destroyed via urban renewal and construction projects that kind of gutted the neighborhood as it once was.
One of the primary intentions of the Wharf is to create a process of incremental change in a part of the city that was anything but incremental. It was totally wiped out and rebuilt all at once. And now this is a first opportunity for the neighborhood to change on an incremental basis.
Modern additions like the arena stage gradually brought Southwest DC some of the mainstream cultural appeal which it has largely gone without for much of its history. Many patches of the quadrant remained underutilized, however, the most obvious of which was the entire Southwest waterfront, which the city government had restricted from residential use and which had never been the site of much commercial activity, notwithstanding the historic fishing market. Given the path which the city had placed itself on, that would all come to change in due course.
Prior to the rezoning of the Wharf, this is something I worked on extensively, there was no housing allowed there at all. So nobody ever has lived on the waterfront in the Southwest.
We had a great fish wharf that contributed not just to our life, but to a big swath of Washington, D.C. life. But, the rest of the Southwest waterfront that was developed in the urban renewal era was just not happening. Was very spotty in what was desirable to go there for.
It's several acres that used to be a landfill, a grass field that really wasn't used for anything. And then the DC government decided to put out a proposal for developers to bid on building something on it.
This vast chunk of land, so close to the National Mall and the heart of DC's tourist economy, proved to be attractive to many private investment firms who bid in great numbers for the right to construct there. In the end, the city selected P.N. Hoffman, who embarked on a project that was meant to redesign this entire area while also giving back to the city in the process.
There's a lot of interest in the site. It was probably the best remaining piece of real estate in Washington, D.C. of this size, where you could build 3 million square feet of mixed-use development. This project it's district-owned land, and the developers have ground leased it for 99 years. So the district owns the underlying land and continues to benefit from the project.
P.N. Hoffman won approval for the project in 2006, but it would take another 8 years and some 800 community meetings to secure all the necessary permits to allow construction to proceed. During that time, P.N. Hoffman joined forces with their development partner, Madison Marquette, and together, the two teams reached some important consensuses as to what they wanted this project to resemble. One important standard they established was that, pricey though this project may be, it ought not become overly luxurious and out of reach from the general public. Furthermore, when selecting which businesses to include on the waterfront, it was important to distinguish the wharf from all of the homogeneous retail collectives out there and infuse this new space with important elements of DC's local business culture.
It's important to know that the Wharf has a mixture not just of uses, but also of income levels, and that's part of the vision of creating a place that's accessible to all.
I think it was important from us from the beginning to get a group of retailers, restaurateurs, all of the folks that have occupied our retail space for the most part are non-national, small, unique, local retailers.
One significant gesture in that regard is the inclusion of Politics and Prose. For almost 30 years, this bookstore has thrived at its present location on Connecticut Avenue. To be opening a second store marks a major move both for Politics and Prose as an independent organization and for the Wharf in its attempt to win favor with local residents.
Having an authentic DC character has been achieved gold star by having the Politics and Prose there. That is a Washington, D.C. institution. It's beloved and it's highly, highly valued.
Politics and Prose, which is one of the rarest things on earth, which is a local independently owned bookstore. They've all gone the way of the dinosaur, but they're here.
For the Wharf developers, it was attractive to have a business like Politics and Prose that is a known commodity, really respected and beloved in DC, that also will bring in crowds a lot of the time for our events. So from my knowledge, they wanted this development to have a local character. They didn't just want to bring in generic, chain stores that are national. So, they went with us, and we, couldn't be more happy with how it's gone so far.
Around the corner from Politics and Prose stands the Anthem, a $60 million concert venue operated by IMP Productions, who already runs some very popular venues around town such as the 930 Club. The Wharf represents much the same value for this company as it does for Politics and Prose, a chance to take a beloved Washington, D.C. institution and expand its commercial potential and fan base at a brand new site.
930 Club will always be the 930 Club. It's not going to change, but opening this venue gives us another place to be able to put acts that are big and getting bigger.
And one of the developers thought, well, if we're going to open up a 4,200 person venue, they're thinking, well, who are we going to go to? Are we going to go to Joe Schmo, who's never done this before? No, we're going to go to the #1 operator in Washington, D.C., who we know he's done this before, and we know he has all the contacts, and we know he has all the balance sheet and the money to make this whole thing happen.
I think the Anthem has been a big hit with people that I've talked to. It's pretty rewarding to go into a space that 6,000 people are enjoying the music, because you can see all the energy and excitement in there. That's been particularly rewarding to see.
From allowing a family-run bike store to open an additional shop, to equipping the neighboring fish market with a massive new refrigerator, there are many further ways in which the Wharf has made a clear and commendable service to DC's local business culture. Another important way in which the Wharf has the potential to contribute to its host city is in helping it to transform into a true river town. Historically, Washington, D.C. has owed an enormous amount to its nearly 25 miles of riverfront, the establishment of its earliest people, its initial discovery by Europeans in 1608, and even its being selected as the capital of the emerging nation in 1790. But sadly, Washington's modern-day treatment and nurturing of the Potomac and Anacostia have left so much to be sorely desired.
One thing that always struck me is that why does DC not have any place to go hang out on the water? The water is all along, and why was it not used?
So I would say the two things that have really limited DC being known as a water city in the past are, one, public access, and two, quality of the water. And I think for a long time, the Potomac had very bad water quality. And even now, we're still in a situation where when there's heavy rains, sewage overflow goes into the Potomac.
There's been a lot of talk in DC about sort of reclaiming the water as this incredible resource that has been neglected in DC. So I do see the Wharf as part of that broader attempt by DC to make DC once again a place known by its waterfront areas, and where those waterfront areas are no longer seen as polluted, dangerous, but as the best the city has to offer.
There really wasn't good use of the waterfront itself. There was no public access to the water. So those of us that lived at the marinas down here, we were able to access the water, but all the other neighbors in Southwest didn't really have good public access at all. So interesting things that happened with the Wharf is they created public access. At 7th Street Pier, there is public access. You can take down any paddle craft and just put it in the water there, and that's pretty cool. And also the two long public docks gave the public a way to walk out onto the water and feel like they're, somehow being able to interact with the Washington Channel. Before the Wharf, most people that weren't familiar with the Southwest waterfront didn't really think of Washington as a river city. And it'll be interesting to see how that changes after the Wharf.
By ushering in a wave of piers, kayaks, water taxis, and more, the Wharf should be able to contribute to Washington's water culture single-handedly. In time, these efforts might not be so single-handed either. The Wharf can conceivably serve as a stepping stone for further development in the rest of DC's waterside communities. perhaps most critically in nearby Southeast.
People are now going to that part of the city that had not been to that part of the city. There's a draw now to the southwest waterfront that wasn't there before.
It's going to get more people down to the waterfront and interested in interacting with and caring for the river here. But also I think that it's going to be a catalyst for all other waterfront development, both in Southwest and in Southeast.
I really envision Southeast DC across the river being like the future Brooklyn of Washington DC, because you have to cross the water to get there. But you know, it's kind of like Manhattan's, you know, little up and coming brother.
We're in a phase right now where everything along the water is being redeveloped, and DC's trying to really make sure that part of its identity is as a waterfront city. It's going to help us feel like we care about this river and like we're going to try to take care of it and make sure that the water is clean. And I think that in turn is going to make it so that the city has a place where they can swim, where they can fish, where they can recreate. And I think that's going to help the overall health and enjoyment of residents in the city, because it's another place where they can be outdoors and they can enjoy nature.
People are finally starting to see this amazing natural resource that's been hiding in plain sight for way too long. Now we're at this really unique point where these rivers that have for generations divided the city have an opportunity to unite it.
There is a lot to be excited about with the arrival of the wharf. But conversely, are there any reasons to be cautious as well? A lot of expensive properties are being established at once in a neighborhood where the last major scale development has been described as a case study of everything urban renewal got wrong about cities and people. During that period, many residents were driven across the river into the southeast quadrant, which has largely remained a troubled and neglected area ever since. Those interviewed for this film expressed a variety of compelling insight as to how Southwest DC's newest component might avoid these consequences of the urban renewal era, as well as those of other infrastructure projects in Washington, and propel this neighborhood in the proper and intended direction.
What's called property taxes are going up like crazy. People are getting priced out, but that's just capitalism, if you ask me. You know, like these people might have bought those homes for as little as $10,000 to $50,000, you know, a generation ago, and now they can sell those homes for $500,000 upwards, maybe $1 million if they have a big place.
Much of the housing at the wharf has been subsidized by the public, by public tax dollars, in order to be accessible to people of lesser means.
Like any development project here in DC, there are issues around displacement and gentrification and accessibility that are undeniable. We have made a conscious effort to listen to people who live here, to all sides, and make sure that we're catering to everyone.
There's some trade-offs for sure, and there's a socio-economic impact that's occurring, but overall I think it's for the better, definitely for the better of the city, just because it's adding a lot of vibrancy, a lot of amenities really for people to come in and come to Washington, D.C.
It's part of this larger effort to invigorate Washington, D.C.'s, you know, socioeconomic structure, tax base, you know, economics, so that the city can, you know, support itself.
It is catalytic in that sense. It's going to help bring additional resources to many neighborhoods in the city that have historically been left out of the reinvestment process.
Certainly, there are broad conversations to be had about how the wharf can be established while causing minimal disruption and displacement. But in the end, perhaps that is where the primary strength of this project may lie, as a way of bringing the different sectors of the city and greater region in conversation with one another. As can be observed by simply staring down Main Avenue, the wharf is practically adjacent to the Washington Monument and the National Mall, one of the most toured areas in the United States, the headquarters of the federal government, the highway leading into the rapidly expanding DC suburbs, and the city's own residential areas, where the population is now climbing by nearly 10,000 a year after having spent decades in a free fall. All of these different components of the DC landscape have unrestricted access to the District Wharf. In a city that has long been marred by segregation and class divide, there is plenty to applaud in the introduction of such a fertile ground for social interaction and cultural celebration.
So in terms of that being a literal site where many different kinds of people are coming together to check out this new area, I think that's a good thing.
In a certain sense, it's a social experiment, and it's up to us to take advantage of that to help our city grow.
So yeah, we'll see what the future holds, but you know, based on our experience thus far, it's just going to be super positive. Can't wait to be a part of it.